The digital clock in the Empire State Building's meeting room read exactly 9 a.m. when I, Michael Turner, a 45-year-old man, entered. The glass-walled, luxurious space offered a panoramic view of the city that never sleeps. From the 50th floor, New York seemed to vibrate with opportunities. But for me, that day would be marked by ruin. In my leather briefcase, I carried projects I had been championing for months, all focused on sustainability and local production. Across the table, Richard Coleman, the new CEO, displayed a cold, calculating smile. The man in his custom-tailored suit and Swiss watch made no effort to hide his contempt. The directors watched in silence, waiting for the spectacle. I knew I would be tested, but I didn't expect to be humiliated. I took a deep breath, opened my presentation, and began to outline ideas I believed were the key to the company's future. "Old ideas," Richard said, interrupting me with irony. His voice echoed through the room with firmness. "Do you really think this company is going to spend millions to fund sustainability utopias? We're on Wall Street, not in a fairy tale." Muffled laughter rose from some executives, and I felt my heart race. The blow was hard, but I still tried to argue, showing numbers and forecasts. Richard stood up and walked slowly toward me, placing his hands on the glass table. "Turner, you're dead weight, and dead weight has no place in companies that want to leave the market. You're fired, effective immediately." The words cut like a blade. The silence that followed was so thick that even the air felt heavy. I froze, trying to absorb the impact. With trembling hands, I gathered my papers while everyone watched me like it was a show of failure. Some averted their eyes, embarrassed, but most seemed satisfied to see the veteran being discarded. As I left the room, my reflection in the glass showed not only my defeated figure, but also a city that seemed indifferent to my pain. Outside, the company's corridors became long and suffocating. Each step echoed like a reminder of defeat. My badge was collected at the front desk without ceremony, as if my history there had never existed. The security guard barely looked up as he noted my termination. I stepped out onto the street, swallowed by the noise of taxis and the rush of New Yorkers. As I walked down Fifth Avenue, a mix of anger and humiliation burned inside me. My 20 years of dedication had been erased in minutes. I looked up at the sky, shrouded by skyscrapers, and felt minuscule, crushed by a system that forgives nothing. I thought of my family, my home in Brooklyn, and what I would say when I got there. At the subway entrance, I sat on a cold metal bench. This wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of an entire life dedicated to the same company. I tried to imagine what I would do next, but my mind was foggy. My only certainty was that Richard had made a mistake in underestimating me. The train arrived packed with workers in their uniforms and rumpled suits. I boarded and stood, holding the iron bar. Each tired face seemed to reflect my own pain. New York, with all its shine, could be cruel to those who fell. I knew that, but I never thought I would be such a direct victim. Upon exiting in Brooklyn, I walked through familiar streets, passing immigrant shops and colorful murals. The city still pulsed, indifferent to my personal drama. I entered my simple apartment, set the briefcase on the table, and finally allowed myself to collapse. That was the end of an era, but unknowingly, it would also be the beginning of something much greater. The next morning, I woke up early, still feeling the weight of humiliation. The coffee cooled on the kitchen table as I read, incredulous, the emails arriving on my phone. The company had issued an internal memo announcing my dismissal, describing me as someone resistant to innovation and unable to keep up with the market. It was the final sentence for my reputation. The news spread quickly among former colleagues. Some sent cold farewell messages, others simply ignored me. For those still at the company, keeping their distance from me was the safest choice. I had become a corporate ghost, an example to be avoided. My wife Claire tried to console me. Maybe it's an opportunity to start over, she said, pouring me coffee. But I was far from seeing hope. To me, everything I had built seemed lost overnight. I couldn't imagine who in New York would hire someone who had just been discarded so publicly. As I went out for a walk through Brooklyn streets, I felt the city like never before. Cold, competitive, and relentless. Manhattan's shiny storefronts seemed to mock my defeat. I walked to the Brooklyn Bridge and stood staring at the skyscrapers on the other side, reflecting on how the same city that had elevated me now crushed me. Back at the apartment, I turned on the TV and, to my astonishment, saw Richard Coleman giving an interview to CNBC. The new CEO talked about modernization, innovation, and the need to renew the team. Though he didn't name names, everyone knew who he was referring to. It was another public stab. I turned off the TV, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. With every minute, the narrative that I was outdated solidified. The doors of the market seemed to close before I could even knock. That's when I decided I wouldn't let myself be destroyed. I would find a way to turn things around. That night, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I mentally reviewed my projects. The ideas Richard had called old still burned in my mind. I knew they were ahead of their time, but they needed courage and resources to become reality. Maybe there was still someone willing to see my value. 2 days after my dismissal, the phone rang. I answered without expectation, but the voice on the other end changed everything. "Mr. Turner, this is Evelyn Carter, Vice President at HarborTech in Boston. I'd like to discuss your ideas. I believe we can work together." For a moment, silence filled the room. I didn't know if I was dreaming or awake. My heart raced, and a discreet smile escaped for the first time since my fall. My former company's competitor wanted to hear what I had to say. It was the beginning of something that would change not only my life, but also the fate of those who underestimated me. That night, looking out the window at New York's illuminated horizon, I felt a flame reignite. Maybe that dismissal wasn't the end, but the catalyst for something much greater. And this time, I wouldn't be just another discarded executive. I would be the enemy my old company would never forget.
Subscribe now to continue following this transformative journey and receive exclusive updates on Michael Turner's rebirth. The Amtrak bullet train departed from New York toward Boston as I settled into the window seat. The East Coast landscape sped by, but my mind was even faster. Evelyn Carter's invitation had come like lightning in a cloudy sky, a chance to show that my ideas had value, and more than that, an opportunity to challenge the company that had discarded me. Upon arriving at South Station, I was greeted by a HarborTech driver who took me to Cambridge, where the company's headquarters rose with modern, sustainable architecture, surrounded by solar panels and hanging gardens. The glass and steel building reflected not only the Massachusetts sky, but also the philosophy of innovation that guided the company. At reception, I was surprised by the distinct culture. Young executives walked around without ties, carrying tablets and discussing ideas in open spaces. Nothing resembled the rigid environment of my old company on Wall Street. There was dynamism, energy, and a palpable sense of the future. I felt something awaken inside me. Evelyn Carter received me personally in her office, decorated with works by local artists and large windows overlooking the Charles River. Elegant and confident, she didn't waste time explaining the reason for her call. "Mr. Turner, your ideas on sustainability aren't old, they're visionary. We want you to bring them here." I was silent for a few seconds, absorbing every word. For the first time since the dismissal, I felt heard. Evelyn detailed that HarborTech planned to launch a new line of sustainable products, but needed someone with experience and courage to lead the project. And she believed I was that man. "You'll have unlimited resources and creative freedom," Evelyn said, with a challenging glint in her eyes. "But you'll also have enemies. Your old company won't sit idly by." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility. I knew accepting meant more than just a job. It would be declaring war on the past. After the meeting, I was taken to tour the labs and research team. Young engineers worked on prototypes for clean energy, green logistics software, and new production models. Every detail seemed to confirm I was in the right place. The ideas that had been ridiculed in New York found fertile ground here. At the end of the day, walking through Cambridge's streets, I felt a wave of confidence. The university campus around me, full of Harvard and MIT students, seemed to symbolize renewal and knowledge. It was as if the entire environment breathed innovation, and now I was part of it. Back at the hotel, looking out the window at Boston's illuminated horizon, I made my decision. I would accept the invitation, not just for the job, but for the chance to turn my defeat into a weapon. I was about to embark on the journey that would change the game forever. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. For the first time since my dismissal, I felt that the future wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The next morning, I officially signed the contract with HarborTech. The atmosphere of my first day was completely different from what I had experienced in New York. Instead of silent corridors and judgmental stares, I found a warm welcome, with employees who saw me not as dead weight, but as a promise. My office was on the 4th floor, spacious and bright, with a view of the Charles River. On the desk, Evelyn had left a folder titled Project Phoenix. Inside were the documents that would shape my new challenge. The name couldn't have been more symbolic, rising from the ashes. I met with my new team, made up of young specialists from various nationalities. Among them was David Morales, a Mexican market analyst whose energy and ambition immediately caught my attention. David saw me as a mentor and didn't hide his admiration. That connection would be crucial for what was to come. In the first few days, I noticed the brutal difference in corporate culture. At HarborTech, ideas were debated at roundtables, and any employee, whether intern or director, had a voice. This contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy of Wall Street, where only the bosses spoke. It was a new world. When I presented my first proposals, I was listened to with respect. My charts on environmental impact and local production plans were received with enthusiasm by the team, who saw in them not only viability, but also an opportunity for market leadership. The feeling of relief was indescribable. During a strategy meeting, Evelyn reminded me, "Michael, you're about to drop a bomb in the heart of Wall Street. Richard Coleman won't stay quiet. Prepare for the counterattack." Those words echoed in my mind as both a warning and a challenge. I knew the war was just beginning. At night, as I walked through the illuminated MIT campus, I thought about how my life had changed in a matter of days. From a discarded man, I had become a key piece in the biggest competitor. Boston, with its historic bridges and intellectual atmosphere, seemed to give me strength to move forward. The past still hurt, but it was starting to be replaced by something greater: purpose. Now, it wasn't just about proving I was right. It was about building something that would make history and topple those who despised me. Back in my office, I looked again at the Project Phoenix folder. I knew that from then on, every decision I made would impact not only my life, but the entire industry. I smiled discreetly, ready to start the battle. It was just the beginning, but I already felt that I was in the right place at the right time, and that my revenge had begun.
The weekend arrived, and I decided to explore Boston's historic streets, trying to absorb the new environment. I walked through Beacon Hill with its red brick houses and cobblestone streets. But in my mind, there was only one thought: Richard Coleman. Every corner seemed a reminder that I'd been discarded like nothing. At a corner cafe, I had an espresso while reading the Boston Globe. To my irritation, an article highlighted Richard as the new face of modernization on Wall Street. The piece described him as a visionary, someone willing to cut whatever was necessary to take the company into the future. I crumpled the newspaper in anger.
I knew it was just cheap marketing, but it hurt to see the rival being exalted. Back at the hotel, I spent hours revisiting my old projects: sustainable production lines, partnerships with local suppliers, circular economy strategies. All of that had been ridiculed, but I knew it had value. The resentment was turning into fuel. It wasn't enough to just get back up. I wanted to prove, publicly, that I was right. On Monday, Evelyn found me in my new office and noticed the spark in my eyes. "You're not just here to work, you're here to win," she said firmly. I replied, "I don't just want to win, I want to take down Richard. He needs to learn that the market doesn't forgive arrogance." Evelyn smiled. "Then we're on the same side." That night, sitting on the edge of the Charles River with the city's lights reflecting on the water, I made a silent promise to myself. That dismissal would be ground zero for my rise. The contempt I had suffered would become the foundation of my revenge. Suddenly, the noise of young runners passing by in Harvard Business School t-shirts caught my attention. I thought, maybe that's it. Knowledge, innovation, and courage. 3 weapons Richard doesn't have. With that thought, I stood up determined. The next day, I gathered my team for a preliminary presentation. David Morales's attentive eyes, sitting in the front row, reflected confidence. I spoke with energy I hadn't felt in years. We're not just launching a project, we're launching a movement. And this movement will change the American market. The applause was spontaneous, but what marked me most was the feeling of leadership. I wasn't just an employee in a new company. I was becoming a symbol of resistance against corporate arrogance. At the end of the day, I walked again through Cambridge's illuminated streets. The resentment still pulsed, but now mixed with determination. I was ready to fight and win.
The first major step of Project Phoenix began with the presentation of reports to HarborTech's board. In a modern room with interactive walls and digital screens, I showed how my ideas could reduce costs and increase the brand's credibility in the North American market. What had once been called old was now seen as revolutionary. The board members listened attentively. One of them, the veteran Robert Whitman, stood up and said, "Turner, you have here what could be the future of American corporations, but know that you'll be buying a war with Wall Street." I replied firmly, "Then let it be a war. I'm ready." Days later, the impact began to show. Magazines like Forbes and Fortune started citing HarborTech as an example of sustainable innovation. Financial reports showed increased investor interest. For the first time, I saw my concepts coming to life on a real scale. The repercussion was so strong that it began to directly affect Richard's company in New York. Old clients questioned why they weren't adopting similar measures. The echo of change spread, and Richard realized that my shadow was haunting him again. In an internal meeting, Richard exploded. "Turner is a dinosaur. How did this man manage to make headlines again?" His directors exchanged glances without the courage to contradict him, but deep down, they all knew something dangerous was happening. Meanwhile, in Boston, I celebrated discreetly with Evelyn and David at an Italian restaurant in the North End. Over glasses of wine, Evelyn said, "You have no idea what you've just started. This city will remember your name." I, looking out the window at the bustling streets, thought, "And it won't be just this city. It'll be the whole country." In the following weeks, HarborTech's sales figures skyrocketed. I began receiving invitations to speak at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where my talks attracted students and journalists. I was becoming a national reference. But along with recognition came the first signs of counterattack. Anonymous notes began circulating in the media, questioning my ability and my past. It was clear that Richard wouldn't sit idly by. Even so, I didn't back down. On the contrary, Every attack served as reinforcement that I was on the right path. My ideas, rejected in New York, now flourished in Boston and became a real threat to the empire that had discarded me. In the heart of Wall Street, the rival company's meeting room buzzed. Richard Coleman paced back and forth, anger etched on his face. On the table were several newspaper and magazine clippings, all talking about HarborTech's success and my ideas. What had once been called old was now turning into headlines.
"This is unacceptable," Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "Turner was dead weight, and now he's being painted as a visionary. We can't let this continue." His team, made up of lawyers and marketing specialists, listened in silence. They knew Richard wasn't just worried about the competition's success. He was obsessed with destroying me. The first order was clear: launch an aggressive campaign against HarborTech. They hired advertising agencies to question the viability of the sustainable projects and spread doubts about the Boston company's credibility. At the same time, lawyers began preparing lawsuits, trying to delay my expansion with bureaucratic accusations. Meanwhile, on television, Richard gave an exclusive interview to CNBC. In a calculated tone, he stated that some competitors are trying to sell unviable dreams as if they were innovation. Without naming names, everyone knew who he was referring to. The attack was direct, and the corporate war was declared. In Boston, I watched the interview in the office, alongside Evelyn and David. I felt a chill down my spine, but also a fire in my heart. "They're scared," Evelyn said, crossing her arms. "And when the enemy is scared, it's because you're on the right path." I nodded. "Then let's keep advancing." The following days were marked by tension. Negative headlines began appearing in New York newspapers, describing me as an outdated executive trying to reinvent himself. Despite the criticism, the public still showed curiosity about my projects. The game of public opinion had begun. Richard didn't just want to tarnish my reputation. In secret meetings, he hired consultants specialized in corporate espionage. The goal was simple: infiltrate someone inside HarborTech and steal strategic information. Back in Boston, I worked tirelessly on Project Phoenix. Even aware that I was being attacked, my determination only grew. Every new report showing sales growth was a silent victory against Richard. That night, as I looked out my office window at Cambridge's illuminated horizon, I thought, if they want war, they'll have it. But I won't just resist. I'll win. The first signs of sabotage emerged discreetly. A financial report sent to HarborTech's board contained grotesque errors, projecting unreal losses. I was puzzled. My team was too competent for such mistakes. Upon investigating, I discovered that the data had been tampered with before reaching the board's table. In the same period, anonymous emails began circulating among Boston journalists, suggesting I had been fired from New York for involvement in ethical scandals. The messages were false, but they caused immediate damage. Headlines in blogs and smaller sites spread doubts about my integrity. Evelyn called an emergency meeting. "We're being attacked from all sides," she said, showing the news clippings. "They want to undermine trust in you, Michael." I took a deep breath, staying calm. "Then we need to be faster, stronger. What they call weakness will be our greatest weapon." Meanwhile, within HarborTech itself, resistances began to emerge. Some veteran executives distrusted me and feared that my presence would bring trouble to the company. In a tense meeting, Robert Whitman said,
Turner, you've brought visibility, but you've also brought enemies. What if you're just a ticking bomb? I didn't back down. If I'm a ticking bomb, it's against them, not us. And when it explodes, it will make way for the future you've always wanted. The firm response surprised even the most skeptical, drawing murmurs of approval from the younger team. Outside, the pressure mounted. Richard's lawyers managed to delay the registration of a key patent for Project Phoenix. I realized I wasn't just fighting with ideas, but against an entire system of power that Richard dominated in New York. Despite this, there were also signs of support. West Coast clients, especially from California, began showing interest in the sustainable products. Silicon Valley investors approached Evelyn, praising HarborTech's vision. It was a spark of hope in the midst of the storm. One night, as I left the company building in Cambridge, I noticed I was being followed by a black car on Cambridge's streets. The vehicle disappeared around the corner, but the message was clear. This wasn't just business war, but personal intimidation.
Arriving home, I found David waiting at my apartment door. The young analyst brought bad news. "Michael, we have an infiltrator. Someone inside is passing information to New York." The shock was immediate. The war had invaded the heart of HarborTech. I knew in that moment that my fight was just beginning. The enemies were no longer just on the other side of the business border, they were inside the house. On a cold morning in Cambridge, I arrived early at the HarborTech building. The silence of the still sleeping city contrasted with the agitation inside me. After David's revelation about a possible infiltrator, I knew I needed to strengthen ties with my team. Trust would be my most powerful weapon. In the daily meeting, I decided to speak openly. We're being attacked, yes, but we can't let fear dictate our actions. If we want to change the market, we need to trust each other. HarborTech isn't just a company, it's a movement. My eyes met David's, who nodded discreetly in support. At the end of the meeting, Evelyn called me for a private conversation in her office. "Michael, you need to know the board is divided. Some believe in you, others think you're risking the entire company. But I'm betting on you." I smiled gratefully. Evelyn wasn't just a business partner, she was my main ally in the war against Richard. That week, David proved to be more than just an analyst. He brought detailed reports showing that despite New York's attacks, acceptance of sustainable products was growing rapidly on the West Coast, especially in cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, where consumers valued green innovation. It was a sign we were on the right path. One night, David and I dined at a restaurant in Harvard Square. Over simple dishes and glasses of craft beer, the young man revealed something personal. "You know, Michael, my father was exploited by big corporations his whole life. When I saw you stand up to Richard, I realized someone needed to challenge that system. I want to be by your side in this fight." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. I had true allies who believed in my cause. That gave me the strength to face what was coming next. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard received worrying reports. Market numbers showed a gradual drop in investor confidence. He exploded in fury. "Turner is turning into a hero. Do whatever it takes to destroy him." His eyes gleamed with hatred, making it clear the war was far from over. Back in Boston, I looked out my office window at the illuminated MIT campus and thought, they tried to bury me, but they forgot I'm a seed. Revenge was no longer just personal. It was also the hope of a new future for the American market. That night I knew I was ready for the next step, uncovering the full truth behind my dismissal. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A former New York colleague, James Walker, contacted me discreetly.
He had worked in the company's financial sector and was now willing to talk. The meeting was set at a discreet bar in Manhattan's Lower East Side. I traveled to New York in secret, feeling my heart race as I stepped back into the city where I had been humiliated. The bar was small, lit by yellowish lamps, far from Wall Street's prying eyes. James waited for me in a reserved corner, visibly nervous. "Turner, you need to know the truth," James said, looking around to ensure no one was listening. "Your dismissal wasn't just the new CEO's decision. Richard needed a scapegoat. You were chosen because your ideas threatened to expose internal flaws that had been hidden for years." I stayed silent, absorbing the words. James continued, "They manipulated financial reports to attract investors. The board knew, Richard knew, and when you insisted on sustainability projects, they realized your transparency could reveal everything, so they decided to cut you before it was too late." The revelation hit like a punch. I hadn't been fired for being outdated, but because I represented a danger to the corruption within the company. Richard hadn't ridiculed me for my ideas, he had tried to silence me.
Back at the Manhattan Hotel, I spent the night awake. The city, with its incessant lights, now seemed like a stage of corporate betrayals. I felt anger, but also clarity. My revenge was no longer just against Richard. It was against an entire rotten system that needed to be exposed. The next day, I returned to Boston and met with Evelyn and David. I shared everything I had discovered. Evelyn, upon hearing it, slammed her hand on the table. "This changes everything. Now we're not just competing. We're fighting to topple a corrupt empire." David, with his usual energy, added, "If we get proof, we won't just win in business, but in justice too. We can change the whole game." I knew the revelation was dangerous, but I also felt renewed power. It wasn't just about personal revenge, it was about justice. I had found the reason that would make my fight even greater than I had ever imagined. And deep down, I knew Richard would do everything to prevent this truth from coming out. The sun had barely risen in Boston when I turned on the TV and saw my face plastered on the CNN business screen. The reporter talked about HarborTech's meteoric rise and my crucial role. The executive, once considered outdated, is now seen as the brain behind the corporate green revolution, the story said. The interview I had given at the MIT Sloan Auditorium went viral, shared by thousands of young entrepreneurs. My words echoed. The future of companies isn't just about generating profit, but creating real impact on society. In hours, hashtags with my name spread across Twitter and LinkedIn. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard Coleman watched furiously. "This man isn't a hero, he's an opportunist," he shouted during a meeting. Determined to regain control of the narrative, he hired one of the country's largest public relations agencies. In days, an avalanche of articles began circulating in newspapers, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, questioning the viability of my projects. I reacted intelligently. I accepted invitations to appear on interview shows, including the prestigious 60 Minutes. There, with serenity, I explained how my ideas were being successfully implemented in Boston and already attracting California investors. My transparency won over the public. But the war was far from just about ideas. An anonymous dossier began circulating in the media, accusing me of manipulating reports at my old company. Evelyn analyzed the document and confirmed it was fake, a fabrication by Richard to destroy me. Even so, the shadow of doubt lingered in the air. On a cold night, walking through Copley Square, I reflected on how the press could be a weapon of destruction as powerful as any sabotage. I knew I needed to act with caution. One wrong step, and all my work could crumble. To counterattack, Evelyn organized a press conference in Boston, gathering journalists from across the country. I took the stage confidently and presented concrete data on growth and positive environmental impact.
At the end, I declared, "The truth doesn't need smear campaigns to sustain itself. It speaks for itself." The audience's applause was deafening. For a moment, I felt I was winning, not just against Richard, but against the Wall Street system itself. But behind the scenes, the attacks intensified, and soon I would discover that the enemy wasn't just outside. The following weeks were a mix of advances and tensions. Project Phoenix achieved impressive numbers, but I began noticing inexplicable failures. Reports disappeared, meetings were leaked to the press, and some strategic data appeared distorted. It was evident there was a traitor inside HarborTech. One afternoon, David rushed into my office. "Michael, I found something strange. Someone accessed the project server in the middle of the night. The login was masked, but the origin points inside the company." The shock was immediate. I knew Richard's attacks had reached the heart of my team. Evelyn called an emergency meeting with the board. Amid suspicious glances, the name of one of the veteran executives emerged: Charles Davenport, responsible for logistics. Davenport had always been skeptical of my ideas and maintained old contacts in New York.
I confronted Davenport in his office. "You passed information to Richard, didn't you?" The executive, a middle-aged man with a cold demeanor, neither denied nor confirmed. He just smiled and said, "Turner, you've messed with forces bigger than you imagine. Richard won't lose." The phrase was a punch to the gut. A few days later, concrete proof emerged. Davenport had received hidden payments from a company linked to Richard's network. The betrayal was confirmed, and he was immediately removed. But the damage was done. Projects were delayed, patents nearly compromised, and trust within HarborTech was shaken. I felt the weight of responsibility. As a leader, I needed to restore the team's morale. I gathered everyone in the auditorium and spoke firmly. They tried to divide us, but they failed. If we're being attacked, it's because we're winning, and we'll win together. The words fired up the team, who responded with applause and promises of loyalty. That night, Evelyn and I met at a sophisticated bar in Boston's Seaport District. Over glasses of wine, she confessed, "Michael, Richard won't stop. You're no longer just a rival, you're an existential threat to him." I replied with a determined look, "Then let's push him to the limit. He'll dig his own grave." Back in my Cambridge apartment, I reflected alone. The internal betrayal had shown that the war was even more complex than I imagined. But it had also reinforced something essential. I could no longer turn back. At stake was not just my revenge, but the future of a business model that could change the United States. And while New York slept, I was already planning the next moves. I knew the war couldn't be won just in Boston. It was time to take the battle to the heart of innovation, Silicon Valley, California. Along with Evelyn and David, I traveled to Palo Alto, where I met investors willing to fund a global launch of Project Phoenix. The environment, full of startups and creative minds, gave new momentum to the team. In meetings with tech sector giants like funds linked to Google Ventures and accelerators near Stanford University, I presented my vision. The future isn't about destroying competitors, but rebuilding markets with responsibility. The words echoed, drawing applause and immediate promises of support. Meanwhile, in New York, Richard received alarming reports. His spies confirmed I was about to launch something disruptive in Silicon Valley. "If he succeeds, we're finished," he shouted, throwing a glass against the wall. He then decided to intensify the attacks, trying to use his political influence in Washington to suffocate HarborTech. Back in Boston, I structured a two-pronged plan. The first, officially launch Project Phoenix in the Valley, with support from California press. The second, gather concrete proof of corruption on Wall Street, exposing Richard not just as a bad leader, but as a corporate criminal. It was risky, but necessary.
On the night before the launch, I walked through San Francisco's streets, looking at the illuminated Golden Gate Bridge. I knew this wasn't just another step, but the decisive turning point in my fight. The man who had once been humiliated in a New York meeting room was now about to challenge an entire empire.
The day of the hearing in Washington, D.C. arrived. The U.S. Congress was investigating corporate practices of major companies, and I saw this as the perfect opportunity. Dressed in a dark suit, I entered the imposing Capitol building alongside Evelyn and David, carrying folders full of evidence collected against Richard. In the room packed with congressmen, journalists, and national press cameras, Richard was also present, surrounded by lawyers. His hateful gaze met mine, and for a moment, the silence between us felt more intense than any words. It was the confrontation we both knew would happen. I presented documents showing manipulation of financial reports and fraudulent contracts from Richard's company. Gentlemen, we're not just talking about bad management. We're talking about crimes against investors, consumers, and the American economy itself. The words reverberated like a punch in the room. Richard lost his cool under the congressman's incisive questions. He tried to accuse me of personal revenge, but his speech sounded hollow. The decisive moment came when Evelyn displayed proof of secret payments involving Davenport and other accomplices. The audience reacted in shock, and cameras captured every detail. At the end of the hearing, Richard left escorted, his face pale and defeated. Outside, I was surrounded by journalists asking how I felt. I took a deep breath and replied, "Today wasn't one man's victory. It was the victory of truth." The phrase would be repeated in newspapers and social media for weeks. The weeks following the Washington hearing were of intense repercussion. Headlines in the Washington Post and CNN blared Richard Coleman's downfall and the investigation into his company. Wall Street reacted with shock, and investors rushed to distance themselves from the corrupt empire. Meanwhile, HarborTech recorded its biggest growth in years, consolidating itself as a market reference. I, now seen as a symbol of resilience and innovation, began receiving invitations to speak at universities like Harvard and Stanford. My speeches filled auditoriums, inspiring young entrepreneurs to think beyond profit. The man who had been humiliated in a New York meeting room now shaped the future of the American economy. Despite the success, I didn't let myself be lulled. I knew every victory brought new enemies. In a conversation with Evelyn and David, I made it clear. The game doesn't end here. There will always be someone trying to exploit and manipulate. But as long as we have courage, there will always be a way to fight. They toasted, aware that the battle had only changed form. One night, walking alone through Times Square, I looked at the luminous billboards advertising HarborTech products. New York, the same city that had once expelled me, now displayed my victory on giant screens. I smiled discreetly, feeling the weight of revenge transformed into something greater, justice and legacy. Back in Boston, in my office overlooking the Charles River, I opened the Project Phoenix folder. The work was far from over, but the flame that drove me remained lit. It wasn't just about toppling Richard. It was about proving that even rejected ideas can change the world. And with that thought, I, Michael Turner, sealed my story, not of defeat, but of rebirth.